Embers Adrift does a lot of things right for an indie MMORPG. It's unique, has a consistent internal logic, and playing in a group feels incredible. But it also has its giants to slay. 5, in fact. We'll meet them later. Plus, not only was I able to join some developers for a team-wide interview, I also spoke with players about their opinions on the game too. So let's explore this indie MMO together.
That's kind of the whole point of this game, is trying to facilitate people to run into each other and form a group and socialize.
Embers Adrift is an old-school inspired MMO with callbacks to EverQuest 1 and other classic titles. In particular, when the MMO was called Saga of Leucemia during development, its then CEO Renfail, whom I even asked for comment yet received no response, played a classic EverQuest emulated server while developing the game with would-be supporters. Moreover, from references to camping when logging out to group-encouraged progression, it's clear why players who'd never even heard of EverQuest eventually came to recognize it as a source of inspiration. For example, leveling is slower than most modern games. I've played around 10 hours thus far and only reached level 8. Emphasis is on the journey instead of the destination. In games that throw loot or rewards at you, it can be difficult to feel the significance of each upgrade. Embers Adrift preserves that sense of accomplishment. Also, you may have noticed that you only have 8 usable skills at any given time, with 8 additional augments or items to use. Guild Wars 1 also purposefully restricted the total number of skills a player could use. This limitation ends up being a cauldron of creativity because it preserves the power of choice. In Embers Adrift, social groups matter. In fact,
one of my favorite bits of feedback that we get when new players come in is they'll say like, oh, I'm actually like meeting people and making friends again in an MMO.
Your progression is mostly tied to those around you. Large swaths of each map are restricted to those who find a way to band together to overcome the challenges. In a way, this reminds me of Warhammer Online zone design, because as you level up, more and more area of each zone was designed around group-based PvP. In Embers Adrift, this paradigm still exists, yet for PvE. This is where the MMO shines. While interviewing some developers, we were in a mid-level zone, and we tried to balance between discussing design decisions while ceasing ads to avoid our inevitable doom. Every base class, called a role in Embers Adrift, serves a very specific purpose. Unlike Guild Wars 2, in which every profession can essentially perform any role, especially with advanced specializations, roles in Embers Adrift lock you into a particular playstyle, with clear upsides and vulnerabilities. Each role has 3 specializations, so essentially Embers Adrift has 9 classes. This is similar to how Age of Conan categorized its classes in that there were 4 archetypes that shared base skills, undergirding 12 classes with unique additional abilities. And for those who remember, EverQuest 2 at launch had a very similar system, yet later revised it to be a bit simpler. I chose to level a supporter role and selected the Warlock specialization that trades damage for group-based support abilities, such as a heal over time or power regeneration. When grouping with the developers, we had long-range damage, close-range DPS, a tank, and me, the de facto CC and healer. The dance to control the chaos is exhilarating.
We have to run.
Yeah, let's run. Run.
Each person had to pull their own weight. Everyone had to look over their shoulder to ensure no additional ads were being pulled.
Yeah, a lot of people have described the game as being very chill until shit hits the fan.
And the whole group had to maximize the various mechanics of the game in order to achieve victory. I can't remember feeling this degree of coordinated fun since last grouping on Orc Hill leveling my Wood Elf Druid. Part of the fun was that we were in an open world, non-instant area. So instead of having the safety nets of instance dungeons, segregated boss fights, and linear corridors, you're out in the open, flanks exposed, with ads spawning on top of you. This chaotic dance was soul-refreshing, and I hope that everyone can experience why this style of gameplay is so enjoyable. Embers Adrift also looks to innovate the active portion of combat, despite being inspired by the classics. For example, there's an important positional system. It's simple enough in that it rewards players to either attack from behind or at a flank against the enemy, but various skills and weapons each have their own preferences for how you are positioned, so the most keen players will be able to maximize the bonuses. There's a subtle brilliance to the design in that it's another reason to group, since you'll never likely leverage those benefits while soloing. Another feature is their active AC system. Similar to Project Gorgon, another indie MMO, armor is functionally a resource, and you have abilities that can reduce a foe's armor so that each additional hit does even more damage. This makes armor management more active than in other titles, and adds another layer to combat. It's a great feedback loop, and rewards the player's ability to properly manage armor. Additionally, those who played Lineage 2 may remember Soul and Spirit Shots, a consumable resource you could purchase to enhance your abilities. Incidentally, Drakensang Online also has essences that fill the same role. What's fun about Embers Adrift's implementation is that these consumables are often found as loot, and particular mobs drop certain ones. But each skill has its own resource, so you have to plan and even farm enough consumables to ensure you're most effective. This is a fun gameplay loop because it provides optional depth for those who enjoy it. Embers Adrift also has a nifty secondary target feature. For example, I can use my heal ability on the main tank even though I'm targeting an enemy. This makes target management more intuitive, which has been an issue in other tab target MMOs. The pandemonium of combat is even felt in small parties too. Triddler, who was a tanky defender, and I had to constantly juggle where we were fighting, the amount of concurrent foes hounding us, and whether or not we needed to escape, because we were at risk of constantly being overwhelmed. Despite being knocked out repeatedly, he had salt kits to resuscitate me. Thankfully, any toon with the right item can rescue a fallen friend. We had to carefully pull mobs instead of mindlessly strolling through a dungeon. In fact, there was a named mob outside of the first main dungeon. It took us several attempts to defeat him, yet once we learned our lesson, we took solace in our success. I enjoyed the actual risk of failure instead of presuming victory without trying. This design is intentional.
So one of the things we did with this game is we really like the concept of
Hold on,
failing,
let's back up again real quick.
failing upwards, or like successfully failing, if that makes sense.
Embers Adrift also has an internally consistent design aesthetic. The rich colors of night remind me of Lord of the Rings Online Skyscape. Even if some light sources are still too strong, the physical dimension of the world feels congruent. Everything just fits. The artistic approach has little dissonance, and the game world honors itself. It's low fantasy with recognizable archetypes. It's medieval in tone with minor flourishes of the hyperbole, such as a moss-infected deer or a walking tree that still has missing sound effects, a note I even made in my prior coverage of Embers Adrift. Moreover, imagine if sounded like you are an adventurer. Nothing more, nothing less. Only nods to Tolkien-inspired fantasy are here, so you won't find a wizard or an elf. But you'll find their echoes around every corner. Plus, like in the Rift, there are sections of zones in which mobs become corrupted that wander too closely. These regions shift around and provide a reagent for how magic is conceptualized in Embers Adrift. Instead of wizards or mages, every class can eventually learn magic. It costs a special currency, and you can even imbue your abilities to make them even more effective once your character has learned the process. By keeping magic both rare, yet also equally accessible, the designers have struck an interesting balance to a staple feature of fantasy MMOs. Unfortunately, some players have thought that magic simply doesn't exist, instead of exploring the manner in which magic is utilized in the MMO. Plus, these Ember Veins also contain dungeons, like Albion Online's randomized dungeons. The game world is not static, and what you end up doing every play session may vary based on how the Ember is flowing. They even added additional optimization features since I last covered the MMO. My GPU is a 3050, and the game performed at a reasonable level, considering that I tolerate lower frame rates in exchange for higher graphical fidelity in PvE contexts. But remember the giants? Here is where we meet them. First up is Nois Ufnok. There's a saying in marketing, if you confuse, you lose. EverQuest is clearly a model of inspiration for Embers Adrift. But EA also notably departs from EQ in ways that are not a function of innovation. It's one thing to make progression more accessible, like how Vanilla WoW enabled solo players to progress versus a group-first approach in EQ, yet it's another to nod one's head in reference while ignoring key elements of why it was so special. This extends beyond gameplay to also include the more intangible elements of game design. Listen to the difference. Feel the difference. The visual direction of Embers Adrift is one of its strengths. In fact, it easily beats Project Gorgon in this area, but its soundscape is lacking, and to its detriment. So much of human memory is tied to the various senses, and since both physical touch and smell are removed when playing in virtual worlds, sight and sound end up being even more important. This is why Guild Wars 1 soundtrack is still so moving, and while WoW's quest effect is memorable, and why EverQuest 1's region felt so palpable. Sound effects from a game design perspective are also important communication anchors. If a skill has a wind-up period, the player needs to know when it's begun and when it's ended, whether successfully or not. Over time, players will internalize these markers to better understand how to use the abilities. These all tie together into making combat feel dynamic while reducing confusion, all through the power of sound. Plus, if there's a wind-up, sound effects can make the finishing feel that much more satisfying. Another area of confusion is whether the world can be interacted with or not. Some games have assets whose entire purpose is cosmetic. Other than collision, they play no meaningful part of the gameplay loop, other than to tell part of the story of a region's architecture or flora, depending on the asset. But assets that do have a function need to communicate to the player that they're not mere decorations. This is because if they don't communicate, we presume that they have no function, because the game effectively told us so. In other words, games need to blend the skill of the player with the presumed intuition of their avatar. The problem in Embers Adrift is that it's not clear whether you can or can't engage with an object, so you presume you can't, and thus you miss out on part of the gameplay loop. For example, when in town, the UI clearly renders NPCs, with whom you can interact, but next to the blacksmith is an anvil. There's no other indication that you could use it other than when your cursor is hovering over it. But if we walk just to the right, other crafting objects are also in the scene that we would expect to use also. But no, they're not usable. This is confusing and breaks the trust between the internal game logic and the player because now we don't know whether or not an object can and should be used or if it's only decorative. This makes parsing scenes extremely taxing because you fear that you could be missing out on content. MMOs that do communicate well are Guild Wars 2 and World of Warcraft. For example, when exploring in either title, the game will highlight rewarding points of interest like treasure chests to draw your attention. Of course, the pace of gameplay in both of these titles is different. Each wants to push you through their corridors of content versus camping an area. Those observations aside, the larger point is that both Guild Wars 2 and WoW show you what's important in any given scene. And you still have the agency of decision as to whether or not you want to investigate further. Of course, the counter-argument is that players should seek out to discover which items are available, instead of the game drip-feeding that information to you. And I agree that a proper balance must be struck. EverQuest didn't highlight items, so neither should Embers Adrift. But this is essentially the fallacy appeal to tradition. Game developers have learned a lot since MMOs came on the scene in the late 90s. And classically inspired titles should still apply those lessons learned so painfully by their predecessors. To be fair, Shroud of the Avatar, another indie MMORPG, struggles with the same problem, in that interactable objects are hard to differentiate from cosmetic ones, albeit they are given a subtle glow to set them apart. This observation extends to how Embers Adrift handles quests too. In short, like EverQuest, you don't know if an NPC has a quest simply by looking at them. Ultimately, in EA's case, this is fine because most quests don't even reward experience. Their justification was,
because the quests in our game don't give experience, because we wanted to make sure that the writers had enough freedom to kind of make a bunch of different type of quests, and like we also didn't want to set the expectation that WoW does, where you do quests to actually level, right? Like so
you don't have to do the quest to level.
But this contributes to the confusion issue. Even EverQuest had experience reward for quests, so players who come from classic backgrounds may think they did something wrong when their experience bar doesn't fill up, and may also decide that doing quests at all may be a waste of their time. A potential middle ground would be to implement something like Black Desert Online's quest marker to represent your character's social intuition, or that quests grant a passive type of experience that's earned periodically. Arelith, a Neverwinter Night's persistent world, enables players to accumulate passive experience that's earned every 5 minutes or so. This means pressure to grind levels is reduced, and social interaction or roleplay is rewarded. Next up is Smash Mash. In addition to audio dissonance, another ironic area of departure is how combat progression is felt in Embers Adrift versus classic titles like Anarchy Online, EverQuest, and Asheron's Call. In EverQuest, you have two types of skills, active and axiomatic. The former are skills that you can choose to perform, such as kick, bash, or snare. Axiomatic skills are more fundamental, like offense, one-handed blunt, or double attack. Other than spells that needed to be purchased and memorized based on a player's level and class, all of these could level up during a combat encounter. And it was not uncommon to receive several of these level ups over the course of a few minutes. This gave a constant sense of progression to EverQuest. Because not only were numbers going up, but you could also tell that you were landing more hits, dealing more damage per hit, and landing more critical strikes. To my knowledge, Embers Adrift only has the active counterparts, and like modern WoW, they only level up when your tune does. Interestingly enough, during Embers Adrift's alpha, while it was still called Saga of Leucemia, they did use EverQuest's axiomatic mastery system. Their current iteration misses out from that incremental emotional improvement that EverQuest had. Anarchy Online and Asheron's Call had similar systems to EverQuest, except in theirs you had to manually apply experience earned, yet each skill still had separate levels that could be leveled up independently of your tune's total level. Moreover, the total number of skills per each class in Embers Adrift is relatively small. For example, my supporter can only learn a maximum of 10 skills, even at max level. But an EverQuest druid during the Vilius era could learn nearly 200, some of which were upgrades of prior spells, granted. Or consider that the ranger in Guild Wars 1 Prophecies could learn 35 skills alone. So much fun in an RPG, especially a MMO, is watching your build interact with others. But if there are so few choices, it removes the added benefit of purposeful constriction. Slotting 8 out of 10 choices is less interesting than choosing 8 from 100. Moreover, part of the reason why the grind in early EverQuest was tolerable was because you knew that every upgrade to your spell arsenal was game-changing. The anticipation to use upgraded spells was so palpable that many of us would save up, purchase the expensive spells, put them in a bag while adventuring, so that when we finally deemed, we could immediately memorize, slot, then use them without having to travel back to town. Finally, using the upgraded abilities was so fulfilling, and unfortunately, Embers Adrift does not have a similar psychological hook. Thus, the lack of incremental improvements and having so few abilities makes Embers Adrift's leveling process feel slower than it is, and may explain why some players feel like they can stomach P99's grind, yet can't withstand EA's. Next is poor. Beyond combat, Embers Adrift needs to take another look at their looting system. I realized that it was intended to be more reflective of a modestly low fantasy setting, yet loot should still feel fun.
Mine, all mine.
Over the course of several hours, I mostly looted peppers, throwing knives, and some gold. I had one upgrade drop the entire night, and it modified my armor class marginally. This is simply boring. I'm not advocating for a WoW-style loot system, as I believe their model has overcompensated into the other extreme, yet finding the balance between fun and useful while maintaining the internal logic of the world would be a major boon to the gameplay loop. EverQuest's loot system felt more rewarding because you could either slay animals for reagents used by high-level players, or foes that dropped coin and gear. Gear could either be sold, equipped, or given to pets to enhance their combat prowess. Even though EQ's loot, according to modern standards, is dry, it still felt more rewarding while aiming at the same stylistic target. I just hope that Embers Adrift can build on its solid foundation with a hefty layer of fun. Meet funner. Harvesting, or life skills, is another opportunity for improvement. In short, it just isn't fun. You click a button, wait for around 10 seconds, then hope to loot a reagent with which you could use to craft. Raf Koster, a legendary MMO developer known for his work on Ultima Online and Star Wars Galaxies, wrote the book A Theory of Fun. That is a must-read for game developers. In short, he argues that games are fundamentally about learning and mastering new skills. Fun arises from the brain's engagement with patterns, challenges, and problem solving. Good game design involves creating experiences that are both enjoyable and educational. The problem with Embers Adrift's current trade skill system is that it does none of these while preserving the monotony of the grind. Rewarding the player's creativity is key when designing fun systems. For example, in Black Desert Online, gathering is a mechanic that does not stand alone. In fact, it is a node within a web of many intersecting gameplay structures. At its most basic component, you must have a tool and use it on an inappropriate item, like a lumber axe cutting down trees. At this point, Embers Adrift and BDO are the same, yet it's also at this point that they diverge. Players must acquire enough energy in order to harvest overworld nodes, and doing so requires you to gain knowledge by means of exploring, befriending NPCs, and completing quests. Thus, to have any degree of efficiency gathering, you must already have working knowledge of the game. This rewards players who have already ventured forth into the wilds, and does not isolate gathering to a secluded activity. But starting out, it takes over 10 seconds to harvest a single tree. This takes way too long. But you realize that you can cut this down by wearing gear with enhancements, using the proper spirit stone, consuming the right food, and having the appropriate pets. Each of these are their own systems with respective upgrade paths. So by essentially crafting a harvesting build, you can now cut down the harvesting time to 2.5 seconds. Secondly, when you harvest a node, you loot a range of various items, both expected and surprising. You presume to get the wood of the species you harvest, yet you can also loot Fairy's Breath. This is an item you can trade for either enhancement reagents to help you grind mobs more efficiently, or for contribution experience that enables you to hire workers, rent houses or shops, and expand your trading empire. Thus, by gathering, you're also secondarily enhancing the other two progression paths in BDO. This feels great because you don't feel like you're falling behind in other areas of the game. Moreover, you can loot fairy powder that sells for a respectable amount of gold. Looting such makes you feel like you're still making money while harvesting. Not only this, but only certain types of trees grow in particular areas, so you must adventure to learn where certain nodes are. This rewards your sense of place in Black Desert Online, It makes the world matter. Plus, at a higher level of gathering, you unlock a mini-game related to that specific profession. Once activated, you learn up to 10 times the experience and rewards, including an account-wide buff whose consumable only drops through this process. Plus, you more efficiently use your energy, making your time spent go even farther. Thus, you have this de facto advanced gathering class to look forward to. The point of this excursion is not to suggest that Embers Adrift should copy Black Desert Online's harvesting system. Instead, I hope that it shows that just like Embers Adrift has a multi-layered approach to its group-based combat, Black Desert Online has the same with respect to its harvesting. Thus, Embers Adrift should consider having parity between its fighting and gathering systems, so that each is as fun as the other. And the fifth is... wait, where is he? I don't want to contribute to a negative feedback loop here, yet if an MMO game is based on grouping, then it must foster a certain population density in order to cater to that type of player. Thankfully, every time I played Embers Adrift, I was able to group, and party play is where Embers Adrift shines brightest. Yet my teammate admitted that his main concern whether to buy the game is its population. If more people were playing, he would have already converted to a paid player. In my interview, I brought up whether they would consider adding a Guild Wars 1 henchman or hero system. They said,
I feel like it goes against the whole purpose of our game in the first place. So like implementing something like that, while yes, it may help the population, what does it do to the actual game itself?
They are exploring making level ranges more horizontal and are trying to find ways that enable the MMO to be more inviting while preserving the player's progression. Embers Adrift's devs are not wrong in that having such a system can emphasize solo play. Yet the question is whether or not they want to bear the cost of the alternative in order to preserve a vision of the game that may not reflect the playstyles of their own customers. With that said, they have yet to launch on Steam, and I hope they do, because Embers Adrift is a virtual world that thrives when players are partying together to tackle its open world non-instance challenges. Plus, it has a very admirable monetization approach, in context to the genre's swing towards microtransactions and the create a problem to sell a solution strategy. Embers Adrift is a free-to-try, buy-to-play MMORPG with an affordable, optional subscription. In this sense, it's nearly identical to Project Gorgon. Unfortunately, the website is also confusing. When you visit embersadrift.com, after clicking Join Today, a modal renders showing the buy-to-play price. But most customers likely want to try it for free instead, so this ideally would show how to try the game for free. Under the Join Today button, there is some text that indicates you can try for free, but it doesn't say how, just that you need to visit your account page. What you need to do is create a forum account, which also serves as your game account. After logging in, you can then download the game and play the content for free. It isn't clear to me which features are restricted for free trial accounts, even after reading the FAQ and perks pages, yet you can access the first 3 zones that grant about 10 hours worth of content. Most gamers know if a game is for them within the first 30 or so minutes, so the free trial is all you should need to know if the MMO is right for you. I hope Embers Adrift reduces confusion, adds fun to its foundation, and finds its core audience, because Pantheon, Monsters and Memories, Project Gorgon, classic EverQuest emulators, and EverQuest 2 new classic server are competing for the same audience. And hopefully, we'll find Giant number 5. Thanks for watching, and subscribe for more MMO content.